I I almost don't know what to say. That's so grotesque. Alrighty, welcome back to another long-awaited podcast of Truth Over Tea. So I apologize. Well, we both apologize up front. It's been quite some time since we've done our last long video. The shorts are easier, and I can tell you,
No.
with three young kids, full-time job, and a small business I help my wife run, even though she does most of the work, it takes a lot of time. So I apologize. My brother apologizes. We will get better
Yeah,
at that.
we do apologize. Those shorts they're easier, but here you go, some more in-depth content. We hope it's useful for you.
Absolutely. All right. So today we're going to be covering how Christianity influenced the West. Now, ultimately, this is a topic that takes a lot of time to cover. So we are not going to get over all of the content in this specific podcast, but we do want to specifically hone in on a conversation between historian Tom Holland and philosopher AC Grayling. So you guys may have seen an episode on Premiere Unbelievable between it's kind of a debate between the two, but in an informal fashion, where they discuss the influence of Western culture and how we came to have these morals, these values that we have today. Tom Holland argues that that comes from Christianity. AC Grayling, he would say otherwise. Now, we obviously are in favor of Christianity. We would think that Christianity, at least from what history shows us, did in fact have the biggest influence on our moral values and duties of today. What are your thoughts on that, Bren?
We're coming from the Christian perspective. We're going to say that it's undeniable, but we're going to try to walk through the claims of maybe each person in the debate. We hope to show a few clips, and then we'll provide some feedback on what we think is going on there. Um, but yeah, obviously we're coming from the Christian perspective, so yeah, it's good to know that going in.
Alrighty, so let's take a look at the first clip here. And so this is going to be, I think it's towards the beginning of the discussion. So AC Grayling is challenging Tom Holland. He's asking him to show one thing or name one thing that Christianity did for us meaning the West, right? Because that's kind of more so the focus of this conversation. And that's the focus that we'll have today, because of course, there is a big influence of Christianity in the East as well, but obviously in the West throughout history, you had Christian governments and just the way Christianity influenced the spread of Europe and everything else. It's just completely different. Totally transformed the West in a much different manner than the East. So let's take a look at this. If I can get this to work. All right, here we go. All right. And also, in case you guys didn't notice, it doesn't really matter, hopefully, we play this in 1.25 speed, just so that way we can get through it a little bit quicker and offer more content to you guys as well. So check it out.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say, I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Do you accept that challenge? Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews, but that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. So I think that all of those are essentially what I'm talking in giving that is I am talking about what makes Western civilization distinctive. And one of the things that absolutely makes Western civilization distinctive, and it's an inheritance of its Christian past, is its assumption that its values are universal. This has been fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values are not contingent, but somehow are the property of all humanity.
All right. So
Wow. Wow.
that is just there's a lot to unpack there. Oops. There's a
Yeah.
lot to unpack there.
Yeah,
Um,
I love this kind of conversation. I'm glad that they had this, and I think Tom Holland is such an interesting person because, as far as I know now, he's still coming from an agnostic point of view, referring to his own personal beliefs. So for him to talk so, I guess, highly of the influence of Christianity is interesting, you know. But right here with what Grayling asks him, it's a pretty bold question, a bold charge saying, I mean, can you find anything in Christianity that doesn't have some link to something else in the ancient world, something pre-Christian, and he's really thinking Greco-Roman, but he may also be thinking of like the zeitgeist things, where it's like,
mhm.
no, myths of dying and rising gods definitely predates Christianity and other ancient Near Eastern religions and things like that. He could have been going there, that was
Right.
quite a
Well,
charge.
he does bring that up. He
Yeah,
does bring
yeah,
up
he
that
earlier.
the dying rising gods thing that's been done and over with by all the ancient cultures, the Egyptians, anyone throughout Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, Babylonians. He starts to name some of
Yeah,
the older.
yeah.
I don't think he says anything within Greek philosophy or Greek mythology about that, but he
Hmm.
definitely does for the other ancient cultures. Of course, there's quite a bit of differences between Christianity and those ancient cultures, but yeah, he does go down that route,
Yeah.
and Tom Holland rightfully refutes him too.
Yeah, but in this instance, I mean, I really appreciate all the answers that Tom gave. Matrimony. I think that's an interesting one. Lifelong matrimony.
Mhm.
Just starting off with that. But one that he didn't say that I think would be pretty obvious would be, look, Christianity isn't just a story about a dying and rising God. It's a God who willingly subjected himself to the level of not being a human, but a servant. And then dying the death of a slave, the kind of death that was just incomprehensible for Romans to believe that a god would go through that death. I
Right.
mean, that just goes against all pride. All pride is gone when you do something like that. And I mean, what do we see as a common motif, I think, of ancient Near Eastern, of Greco-Roman gods and goddesses, is that they're not the greatest people. They have a lot of pride. They have their own pride issues. And so are any of
Yeah.
them going to just fully sacrifice themselves in such a way for anyone else? I would think that is the motif that you don't find in anything else, probably throughout the entire earth. I mean, I'd charge anyone to find something else that Christianity could, that has that in common with
Well,
Christianity.
so there's actually it's the opposite in the ancient Near Eastern religions. So those gods required routine sacrifices to be
Mm,
sustained, right? And so now the skeptic may say, well, Yahweh required sacrifices in the past, right? Before Christ came, there was required sacrifices, but that was for atonement of sin, right? That was for the atonement
right.
of the sin of the people. That was not to sustain God. So it was a difference. Each of the gods in the polytheistic religions and the pagan religions, they needed sacrifices to sustain them. And if you wanted something, you would sacrifice to that god. If you wanted to win a war, you would sacrifice to the god of war, right? If you wanted to be safe or you wanted good fortune to come along you, that's one of the reasons you would sacrifice to like your child to Moloch. There were reasons, selfish reasons that people would sacrifice to these gods. And so now the Imago Dei, right, the image of God, that was completely different from all other religions.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
other religions in the ancient Near East, everyone was a slave. The king or the ruler of that area was the only person that would even come close to resemble God, but everybody else was just a slave. They were just a peasant. And so they had to work to provide these sacrifices, which sometimes the king would do the act of the sacrificing, but the peasants would be the ones to bring that sacrifice to the king, right? And they didn't have any sort of value given to them through God in that sense, right? Any unique value, like the Imago Dei does. Being made in the image of God, we are unique in that. We are different from the other creatures on the earth. We are not the same as animals in that regard. And so this was totally unique. And this is our founders to the United States put this in the preamble to the Constitution, right? Uh, you have endowed by your creator the certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? This is something
Right,
that's
right,
totally unique
right.
to Judaism and Christianity. So that was just a big difference, which has led to us believing we have these rights today. Otherwise, any claims of, um, wrongdoing, these things, how dare you treat me this way? Any sort of like claim in unfairness really just doesn't hold any merit unless you have that value. And so that was very unique. I think that is very, very often that is underplayed and that is taken for granted nowadays.
Well, that connects back to the cross also,
Mhm.
because we have God taking the role of a servant and actually dignifying servanthood.
Mhm.
Jesus says this in Matthew 13. He says, "Look, guys, I'm washing your feet. I am your master. I'm washing your feet. So you should do to one another." I mean, I'm not sure where you would see that in other ancient Near Eastern myths or Greco-Roman myths. But then
None.
when he dies, though, on the cross, it's that image on the cross then becomes dignified throughout world history. I think something that was crazy that you see in the book, in Tom Holland's book Dominion, is that he says,
Yeah.
you know, we have the horror of crucifixion. Romans talk about it. Tacitus talks about how bad it was, and then all of a sudden, 1,000 years later, when Christianity has thoroughly taken over the Roman Empire, you have people commissioning artists to paint crucifixes. Peter is being
Yeah.
crucified in the Vatican. Caravaggio does this painting. It's like, oh, it just went from the bottom to the top. And so now the death of a slave even could be considered something that has dignity. And so again, in Christianity, not only with the Imago Dei, raising up even servants to some kind of connection with God, but the worst possible thing, if that were to happen to you, you would only be something in common with your Savior, with Jesus. I'm not catching what Grayling is laying down there. This is way
Right.
different. The fact that people nowadays wear necklaces with crosses on them, I think, is clear evidence something has happened dramatically different than anything the Greco-Roman world would have produced.
Right. And also like Grayling will bring up later Greek philosophy, which definitely had an impact in the New Testament. That's undeniable. Right? The
Yeah.
logos in the beginning was the word, that is, and the word was with God, the word was God. That John definitely had Greek philosophy as an influence into writing the book, into his gospel. Paul had an influence of Greek philosophy, and Tom mentions this in the debate. It's pretty obvious. But we would never see Jews allow Greek philosophy to entirely overtake Hebrew traditions, right? And in Hebrew, the Hebrew monotheistic concept of God. So along with like the attributes of God as well. So there's a kind of an infusion of the two. More so, I think, from the stronger Jewish roots, but definitely an influence from Greek philosophy. But to say that Greek philosophy is like the main source of this, that's crazy. If you look at Aristotle, Aristotle thought that people were just born to be slaves. And some
Yeah.
people were born to be masters, some people were born to be slaves. There was no equality amongst humans. The Imago
Right.
Dei is completely different from that. And so that would go completely against what Aristotle would have thought. And I mean, so the Greeks and the Hebrews had different sets of laws, but ultimately they all kind of looked at a similar explanation to these laws. And you start to see, like with Philo, I learned a lot of this from Christine Hayes. Um, Philo was a Jewish philosopher, right, who did import some Greek philosophy into his Jewish philosophy. Now, like the natural law, divine law, and then human law distinction, right? That was like someone, you may say that Greeks had this natural law, which is more like what Aristotle was pointing out to, and then you had the divine law, which is the Imago Dei. And I think that ultimately, if we try to say, well, what's going to lead to what we have today, where we think today everybody has equal value, at least we try to say that. Nobody would want
Yeah.
to openly
Yeah.
say, well, that person's less valuable than this person. that
Yeah.
that would just seem to be immoral or not right. So it's clear to me that the Imago Dei took the main, like that became mainstream moral values as society progressed, and that's obviously what we think today.
Yeah, it's interesting because later on, I don't know if you have a clip with this that you'd like to share, but Grayling complains because, well, Christianity later on sanctioned the transatlantic slave trade, Wow,
Mm,
slavery in the Bible. Wow, and we all agree slavery today isn't okay. So clearly, we've departed from Christian morals somewhat. And then
mhm.
Tom Holland brings up the obvious answer. And what? Went to Greek morals, where the Spartans were fine with enslaving everybody, not just for work purposes, but also for weird sexual purposes. Like, um, we definitely don't have their values. And I mean, what can we credit to what can we credit the abolition of slavery in the 19th century? It has to
Right.
be Christian morals. I mean, in England, William Wilberforce and his efforts in evangelical circles to just influence England against slavery. I mean, is that not the beginning of this? Right. So, I mean, it's
Very
really, we're back at it. We're back to even with, yeah, slavery happened with
mhm.
Protestant Christianity, you know, I'm sure Catholic Christianity too, but it's just the whole world actually struggled with slavery. Just because we had slavery isn't so much the focal point here, but what we should focus on is what belief system the world over actually abolished it, and it would have to be um, Christianity that brought that out.
Yeah, and actually, that so I have that clip here. We can talk about that specific because that's a very good discussion. It's only like 6 minutes, and it's funny you mentioned like the sexual slavery because they have each clip because that is crazy. Like the way
Yes.
we have
Yeah.
these Me Too movements and things like that nowadays, where people expect men to behave right because particularly men would be the aggressors in those types of situations, and so like it, it's funny that you have this view of Christian sex ethics being regressive, right? But do do we really think it's regressive? Is it not better than what used to be, like the Greek ethic?
Right.
That's
Right.
when you actually learn what used to be acceptable from a sexual ethic perspective. I mean, it's horrible, absolutely horrible, and Christianity 100% changed that for the better,
Yeah.
all for the
Praise
better.
God.
So first, let's watch the clip on slavery, and then if we have time, we'll go over the sex slavery thing too. But I think the slavery thing is that's a big misconception. People try to use the slavery verses in the Bible to say, well, Christianity supports slavery. I don't think so, and history would say otherwise too. But let's take a look at that clip. Let me see here. Uh, uh, okay, but no, that to me, and of course, that's one of the biggest complaints you hear about scripture is, oh, why doesn't the Bible just outright ban slavery? Well, you should probably look at history to learn a little bit more about that and to see why slavery ended, at least in the West. Of course, it hasn't ended everywhere.
Yeah.
But let's take a look at this portion of the
Mm.
discussion, and then we'll go from there. All right, let me get this loaded. Boom.
In the span of a century, what had been a kind of mad minority opinion by the beginning of the 19th century is convulsing parliaments, is convulsing presidencies, and over the course of the 19th century will see slavery, something that as a Muslim sheikh said to a royal naval officer when the naval officer demanded that he abolish slavery, said, but why would we? Every age has accepted slavery. But essentially, this kind of that is bred of a radical Protestant idea of the flame of the Spirit illumining the heart and enabling people to see what should properly be done. That is something that because first of all Catholics and then Muslims are not Protestant, it's been kind of universalized. But essentially, the impetus behind it is this kind of radical Protestant interpretation of how the Spirit can move people to act properly, that in turn, of course, draws on the mainstream of Christian inheritance.
Now, there is one very big difference between attitudes towards slaves in the pre and the post-Christian period. Aristotle's father-in-law had been a slave. He rose to be the ruler of the city-state to which Aristotle went after studying with Plato. That was a not uncommon thing, not to become a ruler of a city-state, but to be freed and to become, eventually to become citizens and to be able to play a full role. I cannot imagine a black slave in 18th or early 19th century America ever been given that opportunity. And this is after 1500 years of Christianity. I mean, I'm afraid to say.
So just to pause there, I do want to mention he does have a point. Like obviously in the transatlantic slave trade, you weren't buying yourself out of slavery necessarily. But to say that it was common for someone to become a ruler from being a slave, now that's like a stretch.
That has to
That
be
wasn't.
overstated. That has to
Yeah,
be overstated.
right.
Yeah. That's anecdotal evidence. He's saying it happened with Aristotle's father. So clearly, what we have in the ancient world is many cases where slaves became kings, and it's you're gonna need to provide a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
That's harder to believe, especially with the backdrop, the contextual backdrop of what Sparta was like to its slaves. You know,
Right.
or
No.
Athens or whoever.
Either way, just like in the ancient Greco-Roman world, like that just that was not a routine thing. It happened, but it wasn't routine. But anyways, we can get back to the video.
Hmm.
That to look at the Quakers and the evangelicals of the 18th and 19th century, not a moment too soon did their consciences come to prompt them to do something about slavery. But it seems to me itself to be a proof of the fact that the conscience, the outlook, the ethics of the Christian period, in that respect, as in many others, was
Do
no
you
different
think
from the earlier.
that then the impetus against slavery was not primarily a Christian one, but was something more of a rationalist Enlightenment sort of philosophy coming to bear, even if it was having a Christian expression?
Yes, I think so, because it was in towards the end of the first third of the 18th century that I forget his name now, but he was a Huguenot who had gone temporarily to England and then on to North America, and who was a teacher. And in the evenings, he taught the children of slaves, and found that what he'd been told about the lower intellectual capacities and so on of black children than white children was just simply false. And it was he who began to agitate a bit among the Quakers at that period. And this is it's not an accident that this is in a period of time when the grip of the major religious denominations, like, for example, the Catholic Church or the Calvinists, over the minds of people and their insistence that they adhere to a particular way of looking at things. This was the period when that was loosening, and so it made it possible for people then to think differently, even about those doctrines.
So essentially the argument is because we were becoming less Christian in a way, less dominated by Christianity, that slavery was ultimately overturned.
Pause that right there.
Couldn't be. I mean, it's so fundamental.
I find it interesting that what caused a lot of the evils, I guess, the atrocities maybe that happened in Australia to the Aborigines because of the color of their skin. That wouldn't be a Christian background that did that, but more of like inspiration from evolution that did that, or like to actually think that blacks are intellectually inferior to whites because, back in the transatlantic slave trade, slavery was very much racialized. And so
Oh
it's
yeah.
like, okay, you have this dark skin, therefore maybe you are made for this kind of subservient status, right? But like, what belief system really helped that along? And when,
Brendan, can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I don't know what happened. Gotta love technology. But what were you saying about Darwinism?
Well, I just say, I think it's interesting that it's missing from this conversation. I think Darwinism clearly propelled a lot of these racist attitudes that happened in the last several hundred years. And
Agreed.
even pushed the motivation behind slavery. And I was going to say that there are Southern Christians back before the Civil War, the antebellum period, that made apologies like defenses for the continuing institution of slavery. They did do that. And that doesn't mean they were right. They did try to do. I'm not going to say those people didn't exist, but what definitely helped is trying to argue that blacks are closer to Australopiths than we are. And so to try to say that no, rationalism is what freed the Western world from the atrocity of slavery, that would in my mind, be historical revisionism.
Right. No, it contradicts history straight up.
Yeah.
Let's keep watching the video and see what Tom Holland has to say. I'm gonna go back like, let's see, 2 seconds here because he was just getting into it, just about to rip up AC Grayling.
I mean, it's so so clear that the anti-slavery movement is an evangelical one, and absolutely, there were any number of freed black slaves who toured around Britain, who became lions of the hour, who were celebrated and feted. Absolutely, they were. I mean, what happens though is that this great evangelical impetus, which sees Parliament petitioned, which sees Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, rather like Theresa May, having to go and negotiate Brexit when she doesn't believe in it. He had to go and negotiate at the Congress of Vienna to argue that slavery should be abolished, even though he didn't particularly believe in it. Castlereagh's genius is that he is able to persuade the Catholic powers that they too should have a stake in that, because he couches it in the language of rights, which derives from Catholic canon law going back to the 12th century. So he's able to do that. It is also the case that he is able to draw on elements within, let's call it the Enlightenment tradition, which absolutely also recognizes that people are born free and equal. But in turn, I think it's important to ask, where do these ideas come from? And I think that this really is the kind of the nub of the disagreement between us, that Anthony sees this, the Enlightenment, as a kind of a radical break with what has gone before, that there is a kind of middle age of superstition and darkness that intervened when all these book-burning monks appeared and started ransacking everything. And then in the 18th century, praise the Lord, the light comes on and everyone is enlightened. My perspective is that the Enlightenment is simply another iteration of a series of convulsions that have racked Christian civilization and are bred of deeply Christian theological concepts. And it's in that sense that the international law that emerges to deal with the abolition of slavery is able to fuse Protestant, Catholic, and Enlightenment traditions, because ultimately all those traditions are bred of the same matrix.
All right. So the ending comes up faster when you have it on 1.25 speed. Anyways, so that's kind of what we were already saying. Ultimately, Christian theology is what led to this, starting with the doctrine of the Imago Dei. That is what led to this point. And so to say that, again, this is not to say that there weren't problems along the way. There certainly were, but this was back. Nobody really says it anymore, but the medieval era used to be called the Dark Ages. Some people still say that, but usually you just hear medieval, and that's because we were thought to have not progressed from 580 to 15. Like, it's ridiculous. That's 1,000 years. We just didn't do anything.
I mean, I think that's kind of part of that myth that Tom Holland is saying AC Grayling is adhering to, that during the Dark Ages, we didn't have any advancement in learning or technology. In the Roman era, we did. And then there was this pause on basically until the scientific revolution. When we know during the medieval era, you had great advances in philosophy. I mean, you had the advent of the first universities, the first hospitals come up during the medieval era. It's kind of like a knock on Catholic Christianity when they throw away the Dark Ages, really, is what I think.
Right. And there are even, so I can't remember the name of the Pope that said this, but I think it was in the 15th century. Trent Horn made a video on this where he's talking about how the Pope was actually against the origins when the transatlantic slave trade started, or at least like this type of slavery started to begin. He was not for it. He was against it. And it was actually more of a Protestant issue than a Catholic issue. And if that's the case, then rightfully so, that Pope is correct. And that he would be correct in interpreting scripture properly. This is not, you read Galatians, like, I don't know how you can, I'm sorry, Philemon, not Galatians.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious, right? We want to get rid of this issue. We want you to treat each other like brothers, right? Not treat each other like master and slave. What were you going to say?
Well, I mean, I just think that I thought it was interesting when Tom Holland said, even the Enlightenment itself, he thinks of as another Christian convulsion that was happening, something that was thoroughly based on Christian theology, philosophy, that was just changing the West. It's not really that different from Christianity. It reminds me of that debate between Glenn Scrivener and Matt Dillahunty when Dillahunty is arguing that, well, secular humanism, it's not atheism, it's never been tried before, and it's not Christianity, and it actually would lead to a more free society that doesn't have that ugly sin of slavery in the Bible, right? Um, and Glenn simply said, "Yeah, well, I think it's really just another type of Protestantism, and it's another level. It's away from it because you are removing God, but you're trying to keep all of the morals. If you think about it, take a Bible, remove God, and then a couple things that they just secular humanists think are, encroachments on people's freedoms, probably the things against homosexuality and whatnot. And boom, I mean, you have a secular humanist manifesto if you do that. That's kind of what Matt Dillahunty is thinking. Um, they don't realize you're still borrowing heavily from Christianity. And I'm going to go with what Glenn said. I'm going to go with Nietzsche. If you try to take Christian morals and keep them without the theological underpinnings, it's not going to be good in the long run. That those morals don't last when you don't have the right motivations behind them. If God doesn't really exist and he really does not have that heart for you, there is no afterlife. I mean, that's a big one. Say there's no afterlife. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, we are of all men most to be pitied, people who are actually serving Christ, because most of our hope is in the afterlife. So, like, if we don't get any of that, then what good is it anyway? You really think those morals are going to hold up when people are being selfless to the point of inconveniencing themselves over and over and over again with no reward in the future? Do we really think that's going to happen? No, that'll probably fall apart. And that's what Nietzsche predicted. I think I'm on Nietzsche's team when it comes to that.
Yeah, Nietzsche was talking about that at the end of the 19th century. And then the 20th century happened. And, well, that was the bloodiest, most violent century ever
Oh,
in all
well,
of
oh
history.
man.
Most
He
amount of human
predicted.
deaths of all centuries ever.
Yeah, right. The bloodiest of the 19 before combined. Like if you added the deaths of all of them together, even including the Black Plague, which is hard to grasp, but it's true. You still don't get to the amount of people that died in the 20th. But yeah, Nietzsche, amazingly, he said, okay, now we've reached the death of God movement. It's like the pinnacle of the Enlightenment, you could say. And he said, now human value is gone, right? Because God is dead. Human value comes directly from God. Man, it's telling when you have such a nihilist, an atheist saying this. And then he said, as a result, there will be a huge bloodbath coming up soon. I can see that coming. And you know what? Those Marxists their ideology might lead to it. He actually picked Marxism as being one of the vehicles that could bring about this future bloodbath.
Yeah, Nietzsche was a smart guy.
He was a smart guy.
Very smart guy.
My goodness.
He had some weird views, like his writings about God. I read some of them, and there's some of it's confusing. But in some regards, though, he was very poetic and very intelligent. He's probably one of the more quoted of the philosophers nowadays. But speaking of, you had mentioned sexuality, right? As like one of the things the secular humanists kind of want to rewrite the sexual ethics because they don't want to adhere to Christian sexual ethics. Well, I have that clip here, so let's see what happens when we take away Christian sexual ethics too, right? So I just this part seems to like the historical aspect is so imperative, and it's really ignored. It really is. I think Tom Holland makes the point when he talks about the Me Too movement. Like it's literally a movement about women saying men need to stop being, bad. Stop trying to assault women. Rightfully
Have
so,
self-control.
right? Have self control.
Oh.
Well, this is in the Roman times, pre-Christianity, that was not a thing. You look around in the East today, that is not a thing. In certain countries, like in Africa, I can't remember, I don't think it's West Africa, more of the Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, they have certain areas where the mothers, once their daughter will come of age, will hit puberty, then she'll hire a man to come over and sleep with her. It's like a really weird tradition. I can't remember the name of it. I'll have to cite it and then I can put it in the description. It's insane. And this is very common. In many Eastern cultures, it's normal for men to have multiple wives,
Yeah.
many wives, right? Oh, you don't make me happy. Let me go get another wife. And it just keeps happening over and over again.
Very common
So,
in Islam.
right. Right. So monogamous relationships, again, this is unique to Christianity. That's kind of what started that, or originally Judaism and then into Christianity. But let me pull up this video in that regard to the Roman sex ethics. Okay, here we go. That to me is just, it's wild. And if you haven't heard it before, and then you think about it, wow, that's actually, that's really interesting. Like these again, these values that we believe everyone has today, we don't even realize that they weren't a thing until Christianity spread in the West. So outside of within Judaism.
Morality is kind of repressive, puritanical, boring, square, something that we have to jettison. And absolutely the idea that Paul is some kind of hung up guy who just turns up, and Greeks and Romans are all having great fun and orgies and stuff, and Paul turns up like the massive party pooper and ruins everyone's entertainment. But actually, Paul's the doctrine on sexuality that Paul preaches is deeply founded in his idea that slavery is something to be overcome, and that everybody has been liberated by the sacrifice of Christ. Because what he is saying is that every human being, by virtue of Christ's sacrifice and death, now has a value. And he specifically says that they have a bodily integrity, and that every man, every woman, every child has, that their bodily sacrality is a reflection of, in the case of a woman, of the church, and in the case of a man, of Christ himself. And so that's to give a dignity, say, to a household slave that he'd never been given before.
Because they could be used as sexual objects.
Absolutely, they were expected to be used as sexual objects. The Romans had the same word for urinate and ejaculate. And essentially, the mouths, the vaginas, the anuses of slaves were regarded as akin to urinals. These are objects in which bodily fluid can be ejected by the master, and that is their role. Absolutely,
that is insane. That is absolutely insane. I mean, I almost don't know what to say. That's so grotesque. But Christian sexual ethics got us out of here.
It's so weird. It's so weird to see that from where we are, to see that the world was like that, especially if you really grew up in Western culture. It's so normal for that to just be thought of as heinous. Yet for them,
any non-consensual anything is completely unacceptable. And that's entirely because of Christian values. That's entirely because of the West growing up in Christianity. Consent of all regard, that comes from that. It doesn't matter what your class is. It doesn't matter what you look like, what family you come from. Ultimately, everyone is to be treated equally. This comes from Christianity, because pre-Christianity, that was not reality.
no. In Corinth, right? It was a really big bustling city back in Paul's time, and bigger than Athens. And it was actually situated where a lot of ships would come through, and you had to cross over land there, but it was a small little isthmus, right? Small little land bridge. And that's where Corinth was. And so they would kind of have the ships carried over land, I believe, to the other side. And then they would go back, like if they were crossing the Mediterranean east to west, back in the Roman days. There was a temple to Aphrodite in Corinth. And so a lot of the sailors and merchants would stop off and then go pay their respects at the temple. And of course, in order to hear anything, get a good oracle, is you had to go sleep with the temple prostitutes. That was just a normal thing. And so, and to be a temple prostitute, I think, if I remember correctly, had some prestige to it. A family might want their daughter to become a temple prostitute. And so Paul, knowing this kind of sexual, just these morals existed in ancient Corinth at the time, he really encouraged them in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 to be chaste, to really control themselves. He says, I think it's 1 Corinthians 6 verse 18, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you've received from God? You are not your own. You've been bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. I mean, he really was pushing that boulder up a hill. He was really going against the current to try to bring Christian values there. And then what do we see nowadays? The Me Too movement.
Right.
Seems to me like those values are the ones that have triumphed, not the ancient Greek values.
Correct. I can if you would have gone around, a woman particularly holding up a Me Too sign, trying to push some sort of protest with that sentiment, you would have been put to death in ancient
Right.
Rome.
No.
You would have been put to death or worse. So I mean, it's just wild to see the vast difference from the pre-Christian culture, all the way until what we have today. It's just we really have this curse of knowledge. We really do. But let's keep watching it.
Mm.
Be taken for granted. So the radicalism of Pauline and ultimately Christian teaching is to say, no, that isn't true. Everybody's body, no one has the right to have that done to them. And more importantly, that then means that there is an obligation on the male citizen, the master, the lord, to control his sexual appetites, because he is not allowed to do that. And so Paul's idea of lifelong matrimony as a kind of image of the marriage of Christ in the church embodies, it sets in train a radical reconfiguring of the way that people in what will emerge as Christian civilization come to think about sex and come to think about marriage. And I think by and large, pretty much everyone now takes those assumptions for granted. And we can see that. I mean, in the 60s in particular, there was this kind of sense that, Christian morality is boring, let's get rid of it. Let's rip it up. Sexual revolution. Let's go back to kind of the hedonism of pagan days. Let's be Dionysic. Of course, the Greek god Dionysus was a rapist. All the Greek gods were regular rapists. It enshrined the idea that males had the right to use their inferiors in any way that they wanted. And that was something that was essentially over the course of the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. We know what the consequence of that was. And we see that now with the Me Too movement, which essentially is an attempt to reimpose Christian sexual morality. And the paradox of this, and there are so many paradoxes that surround this, is that women who go on marches in support of Me Too will dress up in the costumes of handmaids from Margaret Atwood's novel and the TV adaptation of it. And that, of course, is written as a parody of Puritanism. Yet essentially what they are demanding is that men
control themselves
and essentially behave as Puritans. And the truth is that Me Too would only work, it would only have the resonance that it does if most men accepted the validity of what women protesters were saying. And I think that by and large, they do. And I think that is... I mean, if that is not evidence of the saturating effect of Christian teaching over 2,000 years, I don't know what is.
Wow.
And again, just unbelievable. The obvious impact. That I could not imagine. That is so grotesque to live in something like that. And then it's hard to describe like the vast difference between then and now. It really is.
Yeah, good way to say it. Good way to say it. That really shows it right there.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like Tom Holland had said, the monogamous values the expectation of self-control for a man, right? And it's funny because the Greek gods, they were all rapists. All of them, all the men at least.
Yeah.
Zeus, Poseidon, they're all rapists. There's constant stories of them raping people. If you read his book Dominion, he talks about this. And also, just as a recommendation to anybody watching this, read Tom Holland's book Dominion. It's fantastic and covers there. Brandon has his copy right there. It covers a lot of what he mentions in any of his lectures and his debates, but in thorough detail with tons of historical citations. This man does his homework. He's an excellent historian. Hopefully one day he'll come to Christ all the way. I think that's in process, because if you watch his newer discussions, this is like 4 years old. He is clearly coming closer to God from a spiritual aspect too, not just like this historical finding. Because ultimately, like his story about how he wrote this book was he was challenged, I think, by a Muslim after writing his book about Islam in like 2012, something like that, to basically challenge his own presuppositions. Well, how do you know you're not doing this because of X, Y, and Z. And so basically that sent him on this journey to determine, well, why do I have these ethical views? And lo and behold, that's how Dominion came out. And he realized that
Yeah.
he is a fish swimming in Christian waters like the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I really do appreciate this book. I can definitely say, if you get a chance, go ahead and read it. You know, he reminds me a little bit of Jordan Peterson because
Yeah.
he's really pushing forward Christian morals, and he's saying that there is even a practical value to them. He does say it
Right.
elsewhere, and so yeah, it's like he seems like Peterson. It's like, okay, let's be Christians in culture. I'll call myself a Christian because that is the air that I breathe. But I don't know if I'll say that Jesus rose from the dead. You know,
Right.
I just, it's at times like this that I think, man, if Tom Holland, he needs to really sit down with Gary Habermas, and then maybe we can work something out here, or or Tom McClatchy and hear the maximal argument for the resurrection,
Right.
or
John.
whoever.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, my
Jonathan
Jonathan, that's right.
Well,
Yeah.
and Jonathan McClatchy, he's I think he's like a evolutionary biologist or something. That's what his PhD's in. It's
Oh
funny
wow.
how like that's the direction he went. But I think the best person would be Tim McGrew, Tim or Lydia
Okay.
McGrew. Like they're both like PhDs in philosophy, and ultimately, like it's a philosophical argument. The argument from undesigned coincidences, and then if he really wants to go crazy, he can get into Swinburne's um, Bayesian argument for the resurrection. Yeah, maybe. I mean, they're both Brits. Maybe they have a good conversation. Swinburne has like a very charming way to speak. At least I think he does. Um, but anyways, no, that would be great to see him come to Christ. But that ultimately, Dominion is a wonderful excerpt of all of the history from the beginning of Christ's coming, or even pre-Christ, the world then, right? The world of Xerxes, the world of Alexander the Great, the world of the Roman rule, as that changed to here, right?
Yeah.
Just the way how priests were the first people in the 5th or 6th century to marry people outside of the wish of the parents, right? It was ultimately the father had to say, yes, that was okay. You had to do this. And a lot of times you had prearranged marriages and things like that. That was very common in those times. But a Christian priest or Catholic priest was the first person to do that, right? At risk of maybe losing their life or getting in trouble, because that was kind of a power move at that time, especially for higher up families. You could offer your daughters like leverage to gain a kingdom or something like that, or some sort of wealth or power. And these were normal. This was again yet another grotesque yet normal practice of a pre-Christendom affected world.
Yeah, and I mean, he doesn't talk about this in the book, but the story of Saint Valentine, he would marry Christian couples at a time when Rome actually did not appreciate that. I don't know a lot of the background, but I do know that at some point he was thrown in the Colosseum because of his actions. So it was not normal, and so we take it for granted that you get married in a church, and a pastor, priest, bishop, whatever presides over that, and it's just because marriage is such a big part in the Bible. It was an institution that was created by God before sin ever entered the world. So it has a high ranking theologically. Um, so, I mean, it makes sense that Christianity would place it where it needs to be. I mean, and we could put a whole nother discussion on this one day, but, I would definitely argue that if, um, the state of marriages in the West has really weakened the
Oh yeah.
understanding of marriage as throughout the whole West has just weakened so much, and it's largely because of different morals that came in as a result of the Enlightenment. It's like we need to push back at that and bring back some traditionally Christian morals in order to strengthen marriages, which of course the marriage is the building block of society. We can go on that. We don't have to do that now.
Well, yeah, and we can wrap up with that part specifically. So ultimately, there is this secular movement that kind of began with your David Hume and people like that in the early Enlightenment, and so that slowly started to pick up. And then you have your Nietzsche's, your Bertrand Russells that
Mm.
were more modern and really pushed this new secular worldview. Um, and ultimately it's like you had said earlier, it's Christianity without the Christ, you're taking scripture, you're taking the values of Christianity and Judaism, and then you're just taking God out of it. And say we don't need God, and then a couple things here and there. Well, we don't need that either, but we'll keep the rest because we like that, right? And so we're it's
Yeah.
essentially just using, and this was one of the things that he had brought up was, well, are these moral values and duties just based on human well-being? Right? Well, what is human well-being? To whom are we asking that question?
Right.
And what is
Right.
like that's ultimately human well-being in that is going to be subjective, and so that can lead to problems. What
Yeah.
Hitler's definition of human well-being is not going to be the same definition as somebody else per se.
Yeah.
So these are
Yeah.
the dangers that we get to. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, you said this is the Enlightenment still takes large vestiges from Christianity, or itself is like some transformed Christian movement. Um, the word secular itself was coined by Augustine. I mean, right there, even the words that we used, even the word atheism, well, Holland will argue, comes from a
Mhm.
Christian context. And so even when we use words that you think are against Christianity or free from Christianity, you're still importing Christian context when you do that.
Right.
And it's just good to realize this, especially nowadays when there's a lot of people who do that but don't realize that that's what's happening. And so they're kind of biting the hand that feeds them.
Right.
And so what we would then encourage anyone to do would be to realize, like Tom Holland is, the origin of your moral landscape, and
Amen.
embrace the rest of it, because your moral landscape, like Nietzsche said, will not stay propped up without the rest of it, its underpinnings supporting it. It will not. And so, yeah, if we all stopped believing, ultimately, this is what I'm saying. If we all stopped believing that Christ rose from the dead bodily, that will eventually erode our moral landscape.
Right. No,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well,
I am the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Right. No one comes to the Father except through me. And that truth, right? That's what Christ is referring to, and he's talking about building your house on the rock rather than on the sand. So,
yep.
with
Yep.
that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning into Truth Over Tea, and we'll see you next time. Have a great one.